There is something about a lake that makes people believe it belongs to everyone. Not the lake itself. Most people understand, in the abstract, that water can be owned or regulated or subject to access rights that vary by jurisdiction and property description. But the feeling of a lake, the specific quality of the light on the water in the morning and the sound of it in the evening, and the way it makes the air smell different from inland air, that feeling produces in certain people the conviction that something this beautiful and this open and this present cannot reasonably belong to anyone in particular. This conviction is understandable as a feeling. It is not supportable as a legal position, and the specific people for whom it hardens from feeling into something they are willing to act on in public, at volume, toward the guests of a property owner who has held fee simple title to the Shoreline for 27 years, are the people this story is about. My name is Cecilia Marsh. I am 60 years old. I am a retired real estate attorney, 31 years of practice, most of it transactional, the last 12 years of which I spent building a specialty in waterfront property rights and riparian easements in Virginia. I retired 4 years ago because I had enough and because retirement in my situation meant more time at the lake, which was what I wanted and which is what I have. I tell you my background because it is essential to understanding every decision I made during the events I am about to describe, and because the specific satisfaction available to a retired riparian rights attorney who has spent 31 years reading property descriptions is the satisfaction of knowing exactly what the documents say, exactly where the lines are, and exactly what recourse is available to a property owner whose rights are being disputed by someone who has not read the documents. I own a house on the western shore of Callaway Lake in Callaway County, Virginia. I have owned it for 27 years. The property is 6 acres, with approximately 900 linear feet of lake frontage, which is a significant amount of shoreline on a lake of Callaway's size, plus the riparian rights that attach to that frontage, which in Virginia means the right to use the water adjacent to the property for swimming, fishing, boating, and other lawful purposes, and more importantly for this story, the exclusive right to grant or deny access to the shoreline itself. The shoreline is my property. The water within the riparian zone is subject to my rights. This is not a complicated legal concept, but it is one that requires the actual property description to understand correctly, and the actual property description is not a document that most people outside the real estate profession encounter or read. The development that matters to this story is Callaway Lake Estates, which was platted on the eastern shore of the lake in 1998, 26 years ago, 1 year after I bought my property on the western shore. Callaway Lake Estates is a 78-home HOA development whose lots run from a private road down to what the developer described in the marketing materials as lake access, which is a phrase that means precisely what the property documents say it means and nothing more or less. The HOA's property, as platted and recorded, includes a common area on the eastern shore approximately 300 feet wide, with a small dock, a cleared swimming area, and a boat launch. This common area is real. It is the residents' actual lake access, and it is entirely adequate for what it is. It is also, as the plat clearly shows, on the eastern shore, and my property is on the western shore, and the two sides of the lake are approximately 900 feet apart at the narrowest point. The issue was not the common area. The issue was what happened when boats and kayaks and paddleboards from Callaway Lake Estates crossed the lake and came to my shore. I want to be accurate about the history of this. For the first 20 years that Callaway Lake Estates existed, the crossing of the lake and the casual use of my western shoreline by residents of the development was something I permitted informally, in the way that people permit casual use of their property when the use is genuinely casual and when the users behave like guests rather than like owners. My property had a sandy beach area, a natural crescent of sand at the base of a gentle slope that was pleasant to land on, and the western shore had better shade in the afternoon than the eastern common area, and so boats came over and people sat on my beach and I would wave from the house or come down and talk and occasionally offer a cold drink. And it was the comfortable informality of lake life when lake life is working correctly. I did not give these people permission in writing. I did not establish a formal policy. I waved from the porch and they waved back, and nobody thought too hard about the property lines. This was fine for 20 years because the people who came over were polite and careful and left the beach as they found it and understood, on some level, that they were guests. Beverly Holt moved into Callaway Lake Estates in the spring of her first year as HOA Amenities Chair, which was 4 years ago. Beverly was in her mid-50s, a former events coordinator who had moved to the lake community from Northern Virginia with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has been anticipating retirement and has arrived at it with more organizational energy than the circumstances require. She had ideas about the community's lake access. She had ideas about programming and kayak rentals and paddleboard yoga and sunset cruises and a long list of activities that would require, she had apparently concluded, more shoreline than the eastern common area provided. She had looked across the lake at my western shore and had done the calculation that I was about to discover she had done. Her first conversation with me was in June of her first year as amenities chair. She came across the lake in one of the development's community kayaks. The HOA maintained a small fleet of kayaks at the eastern dock for resident use, and landed on my beach and walked up to my porch as if arriving at a scheduled meeting. She was pleasant and direct, and she said she wanted to talk about a partnership. She described her programming vision for the lake. She said the western shore had features the eastern common area lacked: the sandy beach, the afternoon shade, the better depth gradient for swimming. She said she thought a formal arrangement between her HOA and me for use of my western shoreline would benefit the entire community. She asked what I would want in exchange. I said I appreciated her coming over to introduce herself. I said the casual use of my beach by lake residents had been a neighborly accommodation I had offered informally for years, and that I was happy to continue it on that basis. I said a formal arrangement was a different matter that would require my attorney to draft an easement or license agreement, which would carry costs on both sides, and that the terms would reflect the value of what was being licensed. She said she understood and that she would bring it to the board and come back with a proposal. She came back 3 weeks later with a proposal that offered me a one-time annual payment of $500 for unrestricted HOA use of my western shoreline for community programming during the lake season. I said unrestricted use was not something I would agree to at any price, because unrestricted use of 900 feet of private shoreline was not a reasonable term. I said if the board was serious about a formal arrangement, I would engage my former law partner. I was retired but maintained professional relationships to draft reasonable license terms. She said she would report back to the board. The board, I heard through subsequent conversations with Beverly, had discussed the situation and had concluded that the arrangement they wanted was not one I would agree to at a price they were prepared to pay, and that the alternative was to continue the informal arrangement. Beverly said she had communicated this to me and to the community as the informal arrangement continuing on its existing basis. What I had not said, and what Beverly had apparently not communicated to the community, was what the existing basis was. The existing basis was my personal discretion. I allowed guests who behaved like guests. I could withdraw the accommodation at any time for any reason. No one had a right to my shore. The informal arrangement was not an easement, not a license, not a community right. It was a courtesy that I extended because I chose to. Over the following 2 years, the courtesy was tested in specific ways that I documented without addressing immediately. The beach area began to be treated less like a guest's landing and more like an annex of the eastern common area. A group of residents brought an inflatable play structure across the lake and set it up on my beach without asking. I went down and asked them to take it back. They were apologetic and did so. 3 months later, someone had placed a small anchor buoy in the water just off my beach, marking a swimming area as if the water and the approach to my beach were public amenities. I removed the buoy. A week later it was back. I removed it again and kept it. The summer of Beverly's 3rd year as amenities chair, I came down to my beach on a Saturday morning to find 17 people there. Not acquaintances, not people I recognized from previous casual visits, 17 people with coolers and umbrellas and folding chairs arranged on my beach as though they had booked it. Two kayaks I did not recognize were tied to my dock. A Bluetooth speaker was playing at a volume I could hear from my porch. One man was fishing from my dock. I walked down to the beach. Beverly was there. She was standing near the coolers with a clipboard that had a printed schedule on it. She looked up when she saw me and said, "Cecilia, we were hoping you'd come down and join us. We're doing our first Western Shore programming day." I said, "Beverly, you did not ask me about this." She said, "Well, we've been coming over informally for years, and I just thought," I said, "I need everyone to pack up and go back to the Eastern Shore." She said, "Cecilia, these people are residents of the community. They have every right," I said. "They have every right to the community's common area on the Eastern Shore. They have no right to my property. Please tell everyone to pack up." She said, "I don't think that's necessary. This has been an open beach for years." I said, "It has been a private beach that I have allowed casual use of. That informal courtesy does not create a right, and I am withdrawing it for today's organized event. I would like everyone to leave my property." Beverly looked at me with the expression of a woman who had prepared for a programming day and not for this. She said, "I'm going to call the board." I said, "Please do. In the meantime, I am asking everyone to leave." Several of the 17 people who had been listening began gathering their things. The man on my dock put down his fishing rod. Beverly stepped away with her phone. I stood on my beach while 17 people packed up and got into their kayaks and paddle boats and crossed back to the Eastern Shore. It took about 25 minutes. Beverly was the last to leave. She got into her kayak and said, from the water, "This isn't over." I said, "I know. That's why I wanted to be clear today rather than next month." Then I went inside and called my former law partner. Her name was Susan Park. Yes, the same Susan Park. Property law is a small world in Virginia, and she listened to the full history in the way she listened to everything, which was with complete attention, and then complete silence while she considered it. She said, "Cecilia, you've been permitting informal use for 20 years, and a portion of that time, an HOA amenities chair has been systematically escalating the use toward an implied easement by custom, which is a real legal theory." I said I was aware of it. She said, "You need to document the withdrawal of permission in writing, sent today to the HOA board and the management company, and you need to be clear that no implied easement has been established and that all use of your shoreline is at your sole discretion and may be withdrawn at any time." I said I had drafted the letter before I called her and wanted her to review it. She reviewed it and said it was correct. We sent it certified mail and email that afternoon. The letter went to the HOA board, to Valley Property Services, who I had called the management company in this account for clarity, and to Beverly Holt individually. It was 3 pages. It described the history of informal use, the absence of any recorded easement or license, the specific events of the morning, and my clear statement that no right of access to my shoreline had been established, and that any future organized or programmatic use of my shoreline without my explicit written advance consent would be treated as trespass. I attached the property description from my deed showing the western shoreline boundary. I attached the recorded plat of Callaway Lake Estates showing that the development's lake access was on the eastern shore only. I attached 3 photographs I had taken that morning before I went down to the beach. The HOA board received the letter on Monday. Beverly called me Tuesday morning. She did not lead with an apology. She led with the question I had been expecting, which was, "Cecilia, how much of the western shoreline do you actually own?" I said 912 linear feet. She was quiet. I said, "From the northern boundary marker, which is the large white oak visible from the water, to the southern boundary at the inlet, the entire western shore of the cove is my property." Another silence. She said, "The entire beach." I said, "The entire beach, the dock, the riparian zone, and the access rights." She said, "We've been coming over there for 20 years. I said, "At my discretion, which I have now described in writing." She said, "The board is going to want to discuss this." I said, "The board is welcome to discuss it. Susan Park is my attorney and you can direct formal communications to her." She said, "Do you mean Susan Park of—" I said, "Yes, that's Susan Park." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Cecilia, is there any version of a real arrangement that you would consider?" I said, "There may be. Have your board contact Susan." Susan Park and the HOA's attorney, a man named Robert Childs from a Charlottesville firm that handled several HOA accounts in the region, began communicating the following week. Susan told me afterward that Robert had reviewed the property documents before his first call and had opened the conversation by saying, "My client did not fully understand the scope of Ms. Marsh's ownership." Susan said she had said, "That appears to be the case," and that the conversation had been professional and productive from that point, because Robert Childs was a competent attorney who understood that the path forward was negotiation rather than litigation once the property records were clear. The records were very clear. My deed described the western shoreline in metes and bounds that left no ambiguity. The riparian rights attached to the frontage were standard Virginia waterfront property rights. The plat for Callaway Lake Estates showed the eastern common area as the development's lake access with no reference to or claim on the western shore. There was no recorded easement. There was no prescriptive easement claim that could succeed. Prescriptive easements require 20 years of open, hostile, continuous, and exclusive use, and the use of my beach had been none of those things because it had been permissive use from the beginning, which I could establish through the neighborly relationship history, and because permissive use cannot ripen into a prescriptive easement regardless of duration. I had spent 31 years explaining this distinction to clients. It had never been more personally relevant. Robert said he had explained this to his clients. He said the HOA board had asked him to explore what a legitimate arrangement would look like. Susan said that was exactly the right question and that her client was prepared to discuss it. I want to describe what I wanted from a formal arrangement because what I wanted mattered to how the negotiation proceeded. I did not want to monetize my shoreline. I did not want to become a commercial landlord to a homeowners association. I did not want organized programming days with 17 people and Bluetooth speakers on my beach. What I wanted was specific and limited. The informal use of my beach by individual lake residents in small numbers, the way it had been for the first 20 years, protected by clear terms that prevented its escalation into organized community programming. I wanted the courtesy codified at the scale at which I had actually extended it, not at the scale Beverly had decided to expand it to. Susan drafted a license agreement. The key terms were as follows. The HOA received a non-exclusive license for individual casual use of the western shoreline by Callaway Lake Estates residents arriving by non-motorized watercraft. Maximum group size at any one time, 8 persons. No organized events, programming, or scheduled activities without separate written consent from me specifically. No equipment storage, no permanent fixtures, no anchor buoys, no dock ties without my permission. No amplified sound, no commercial activities. License fee, $1 per year, which was the consideration necessary to make the agreement legally binding, and which I chose specifically because it made clear this was a courtesy extended at nominal value rather than a commercial transaction. License revocable by me on 30 days written notice for any reason, or immediately for material breach. The license also contained one provision that was not standard, a clause that said the HOA acknowledged, explicitly and by name and signature of the board president, that no easement by prescription or custom had been established over the western shoreline, that all prior use had been permissive, and that the license was the full extent of the HOA's access rights to the western shoreline. Robert reviewed the draft and came back with 3 proposed modifications, all of which were minor: a different notice period on one clause, a clarification of what constituted an organized event, and a small addition about what happened if I sold the property. Susan negotiated the notice period down from 45 days to 30. The organized event definition was clarified to Susan's satisfaction, and the sale provision was added with language I was comfortable with. The agreement was executed in September. My signature, the HOA board president's signature, notarized and recorded with the county clerk as an instrument affecting real property. Beverly Holt was present at the board meeting where the license was authorized for signature. She was no longer amenities chair. She had resigned from that position in August, approximately 6 weeks after the Saturday programming day, citing a need to focus on other commitments. The new amenities chair was a quieter man named Tom Reardon who, when I met him at a Lake Association meeting the following spring, said he had read the license agreement carefully before accepting the position and understood exactly what it said. I said that was the appropriate preparation. He said, "Ms. Marsh, I want you to know that what happened under the previous chair was not what the community intended." I said I appreciated that and that the license was structured to enable the genuine informal use that had worked well for 20 years, and that I had no interest in blocking that. He said, "The beach is beautiful." I said yes, it was. The following summer was the first summer under the formal license, and it worked exactly as I had intended. Small groups of residents crossed the lake in kayaks and paddleboards and landed on my beach and sat in the afternoon shade and waded in the water and came and went on their own schedules without organized programming, without Bluetooth speakers, without anchor buoys or uninvited dock ties. I waved from the porch. They waved back. The informal quality was restored because the formal document protected it. The license created a clear ceiling that prevented the escalation Beverly had been pursuing, and within that ceiling the casual courtesy that had always been the actual arrangement continued as it always had. I went down to the beach most mornings before 8, when nobody from the development was over yet, and swam my distance in the cove. The water was clear and cool, and the cove geometry created a natural current that made the swim interesting in the way that open water swimming is interesting when the water is alive rather than still. The western shore in the morning had the quality that had made me buy this property 27 years ago, the light coming off the water at a low angle, the birds at the tree line, the absence of anything that required my attention or management. Those were the hours that justified everything. Beverly Holt moved out of Callaway Lake Estates the following spring. Her house went on the market in March and sold in May. I heard this from a neighbor on the eastern shore who called to let me know in case it was relevant. I said I appreciated the information. The new owners of her house were a couple in their 40s who had 2 golden retrievers and a canoe, and who had crossed to my beach once in their first summer, landed politely, introduced themselves, asked if it was all right to come ashore, and when I said of course had thanked me and spent a pleasant 2 hours in the shade before paddling back. Their names were Tim and Karen, the second Karen in this collection of stories, and the first one who had understood the correct relationship between a guest and a shoreline. Susan Park sent me a note when the license was recorded. It said, 31 years of explaining riparian rights to clients, and now you've done it for yourself. How does it feel? I wrote back, the same as it always felt, which is that the documents say what they say and nothing else, and that reading them carefully is the beginning and end of most of what matters in this work. She wrote back, retirement agrees with you. I said it did. The lake is the same lake it has always been. The light on it in the morning and the sound of it in the evening have not changed in 27 years and will not change in the next 27. The property lines have not changed either, because they are recorded in meets and bounds in the county clerk's office in Callaway County and have been there for longer than I have owned the land and will be there after I am gone and someone else reads the deed and learns where the boundaries run. The boundaries run where they have always run. The Western Shore belongs to whoever holds the fee simple title, and for 27 years that has been me, and the documents say so, clearly and specifically, and they have always been available to anyone who wanted to read them. Most people do not read them. Most people feel the lake and decide that what feels open must be open. I read them 31 years ago when I was a first-year associate, and I have not stopped reading them since, and the reading has never once let me down. The beach is mine. The water shines on it every morning. That is, and has always been enough.